Hi, this is Russ Anderson. I'm going to talk about mesh-deduplication, which is the idea that if you have a bunch of synthesize files that all contain copies of the same mesh, and that's a large mesh, you wind up taking up a lot of space that isn't really necessary, and it's a bit silly. So the mesh-deduplication looks to avoid that. So I'm going to run through a bunch of different cases and possibilities that shows you what some of the different modes are about, and hopefully it will help you decide what you want to do in your particular situation. So I'm going to start out just bringing in a little sample mesh here. This is a Stanford bunny mesh. It's not really all that large. You can go and look in the mesh information, and you see it's around 2 megabytes. So not too large, but this is just our example here. So we're going to start out going to the preferences, and we're going to have the file name increment automatically, which is a typical sort of workflow. You might do this manually or automatically. So now when I go and save the file, I'll do it the first time. I'll make that bunny1, and you can see the file is appearing in the window over there. So, I save it a few more times, and each time I get another iteration of the file. But you'll notice that we've got the 2 megabyte mesh, and the initial file is an OBJ file, which is an ASCII text file. So it's a bit over the 2 megabytes. And then each copy of the file contains that same mesh, and so they're all about that same 2 megabytes size, which isn't really all that necessary. So the first thing that we'll do is go to the preferences, and we're going to switch the mode of the mesh deduplication to imports. And we're also just going to change the minimum size a little bit smaller here, just because it is a smaller mesh. There's a minimum size that it's going to worry about, so we just need to drop that underneath. And now we'll go, and each time I'm just hitting Control S, by the way, to cause another copy of the file to be saved out. And now you see that it's dropped down to about 30 kilobytes. So that's quite a bit smaller, and that's basically the information that's needed for the file that doesn't contain the mesh itself. So now I could go, if I reread the file, I just reread the bunny4 file, and then it's going back and rereading that OBJ file to be able to give us back our same scene file. Now, the OBJ format, like I said, is a text file, and it's not really particularly efficient to read. It takes a bit of time, and on a large mesh, that can be significant. So the first thing that we might do to be a little more subtle about it is when I go and save it this time, Synthesize has saved out a new kind of file. It's a .sbm file, which stands for Synthesize Binary Mesh. And that's a much more direct version of the mesh data. It can be written out and read back in very, very efficiently by Synthesize. So it's a lot quicker than sorting through the data in the OBJ. So that saves a bunch of time when you get these larger meshes going. Now, of course, if this OBJ and SBM are really on a remote disk somewhere across a network, it can still be fairly slow to access that. And, might be several hundred megabytes of a mesh or some LiDAR data, whatever. So we might want to take that SBM file and put it somewhere on our local disk where we might have a RAID drive or an SSD drive. So to do that, we can drop down to a local SBM option. And now when I do the save, you'll see this is a default folder. And let me just go back to the preferences for a second. There's a folder that you can configure here in the preferences that say where you want to put these SBM files in this local mode. So here they're just going in a default folder in the user area, but I could put this somewhere else that happen to be a scratch disk, which is a little bit hazardous, or, particularly on an SSD or RAID drive, whatever. So now this guy up here is irrelevant. It's not being used. Here's our bunny 6 that we just wrote out. We'll go and reread it. We still get the same thing. And now it's reading this one from our local disk drive. So what happens now if we're going to be changing this mesh? If we've gone and made some changes between the different versions of the file, well, if they're all using the same SBM file, then you're not going to see those changes if you later go back to one of those earlier files. So that's a bit of a hazard. So instead, we can use one of the version modes, and now I'll go and I save it out. You see, nothing's happened quite yet. I haven't changed the file. It's still using the one down there. So let's just go. We'll set up a smudge mesh operation here. And I'm just going to click over here, and I'm just using the middle mouse wheel to adjust the soft select distance on that. So we can just move the bunny's ear around a little bit. And now I go and rewrite the file, and you see that a new SBM is produced that's associated with this particular scene file. You'll see it's got bunny 9. It's also got the name of the mesh, bunny there, and it also has some computer data that lets you sort out what happens if you've got a couple different meshes of the same name within the same file. There's actually no rule against that. So this lets you sort them out, and it's also useful in some of the other modes as well. So, now if I go, I write out a couple more of the files, you'll see again I haven't made any changes. So I'm still using that same bunny 9 file. Now I go make a change again, save again, and now I get a new version right after I did the change, and then the next one after that again doesn't have the a new SBM needed, so it's using the earlier one again. So that lets us then be able to go back to one of these earlier files and still have the mesh data available that corresponded to that original file. Now, if you think about this, though, there's a few little wrinkles to this, some hazards, if you like, that suppose I want to go back and clean up these files. And so I might say, well, I don't need anything before the bunny 11 file. So I'm just going to go and delete all this stuff. Take out bunny 9 SNI. But I do want to go back to bunny 12. Now I've got a problem because I've got this little tiny file here, and the mesh data for that is actually back there in the bunny 9 file. And it's gone. You've just deleted it. So that is a hazard that you want to avoid. Now you can find out what's happening by looking at the file information. Here in the meshes section, you'll see here's our original mesh name, and then it also says what the SBM file name is that's being used. This is for our current file, I'll point out. So you can get a handle and look and see which files are actually being used. Another aspect of this is when you go to deliver this file. I want to send bunny 13 to the client, and you send them the 30 kilobyte file, they don't know what's happened. They don't have the actual mesh. So to make it easy to do that, rather than having to sort out what meshes are which, there's actually a scene setting for the mesh deduplication mode. So by default, it's just set up to say, look at the preferences and seeing what's going on there. But now when I want to deliver it, I change that to be never. Hit OK. Now I'll do another save. And now when I get that next save, you see that the Bunny 14 one is the full 2 megabyte file that includes the mesh directly. It doesn't have the need for the extra SBM file associated with it. So that's just a little bit more to think about. On the plus side of this also, the SBM files themselves, if you see one of the SBMs and you want to wonder what's in that file, you can actually just go and import them. It's a new mesh type that's supported by Synthesize. So I can just open that up, and now you see that it's been read in, and now we're looking at both the two of them overlaid, and we have the old one and the new one being displayed. And so just like you can import those as a regular mesh, which they are, you can also do a file export. And way down at the bottom of the list, there's the option to write a Synthesize binary mesh, so you can do that as well. So to summarize, the mesh deduplication is a very useful technique when you're versioning your files and have a bunch of different files and you've got these large meshes. It might be a set model or an object that you're tracking, a real big car model, whatever. But you do have to be paying a little bit of attention to make sure that you don't, throw out the baby with the bathwater here. So a little bit dangerous, good feature for you pro users out there. So thanks for watching.